Well, thank you, everyone. We're really excited to get started here. We have so much wonderful information to cover. I'm Mary Phillips. I am the head of Garden for Wildlife. I've been with the National Wildlife Federation since 2014. Really excited to share the results of this amazing study that's been happening over several years, and wanted to share my screen with a little background for those of you that are newer to National Wildlife Federation and this program. One of the reasons this is so exciting is this is kind of fast forwarding from the original research that was done in 1972 and then turned into what many people knew as the Backyard Habitat Program in 1973. And at that time, U.S. Forest Service researchers Richard DeGraff and Jack Ward Thomas published a study showing that the tools wildlife managers use, providing food, water, cover, places to raise young, using also sustainable practices and native plants, also work on a smaller scale in backyards. And that's really when Garden for Wildlife and Certified Wildlife Habitats was the foundation of that. And the following year, after the study was released, they worked with National Wildlife Federation to create that program. Today, we have an amazing number of, 275,000 certified wildlife habitats. We just hit that number. Really exciting. With our estimates based on the types of properties and doing an analysis of all the different kinds of properties that are in this certified wildlife habitat system, and also looking at the numbers of people per household, we've estimated through these certified wildlife habitats, through our schoolyard habitats, our places of worship, sacred grounds, community wildlife habitats, we have estimated over 7 million wildlife gardeners engaged where they live, work, play, learn, and worship. So really excited to show how their work is actually making a difference. And that's really what today's webinar is all about. One of the things I wanted to say also is, in order to help people do this, we actually are providing these amazing native plant collections. And just in a year, we've had an additional 10,000 gardens purchased this year and are being planted. Really, really excited about that. It's all part of really, bringing forward this work on such a large scale. And one of the reasons is because the wildlife crisis is accelerating. The good news is we've had a report that just came out this last week that shows some movement on the needle to helping monarch butterflies, which has been very encouraging. But unfortunately, over the last 20 plus years, 90% of those butterflies have disappeared. So many people are working to make a difference, and that is starting to show some results in the most recent numbers that were reported this past week or so from World Wildlife Fund. 1 in 4 native bee species are at risk at extinction. That's a role people can really play and make a difference in. And 3 billion songbirds have disappeared as well since 1970. So I think this is why we're all here. We're really excited, and we're going to dig into this amazing research. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Peter Groffman. So excited to have him here and present this amazing macrosystem study results, and tell you how this is impacted also certified wildlife habitats. So I'm going to stop share, Peter, and turn it over to you.
Okay. Just before I start to share my screen, several of us are going to talk about a research project that we've been involved with for the last 10 years or so. And we have benefited enormously from all you wildlife gardeners out there. So we are very interested in doing science on what's going on in people's yards. And the availability of thousands of certified wildlife, National Wildlife Federation certified yards in the cities that we work in has been an enormous boon to our research. And so we're just delighted to be here and very grateful for all the help we've gotten from the Wildlife Federation and all you people over time. Okay, so our research, and so this is a research project, and the research originated. We started talking about this about 15 years ago or so because there were many people that were wondering, why do our cities all look the same? And you look at this picture, and if you look pretty clear, look pretty hard, you can tell pretty clearly that the city on the left here is Phoenix. and this one is Boston. There's more pools and the trees are smaller. But it's kind of a lot of people have noticed this curiosity, why do our residential neighborhoods look all the same wherever we go? And why do they look all the same in different parts of the country? So if you look and you can see here, this is the native desert in Phoenix, looks really different than the native forest outside of Boston, but the residential neighborhoods look pretty much the same. And this led to ecological questions about homogenization or convergence or ecological homogenization. As humans spread out across the world, making these residential neighborhoods that look all about the same, are we reducing the diversity or homogenizing the places where we live, kind of reducing this natural variability in natural ecosystems is big, and are we reducing that? And we're doing it all over the place. So if you look at, this is a map of the lights of the United States at night, and pretty much everything under the lights is that mixture of grass and trees and shrubs and pavement that characterize our residential neighborhoods. And as you saw, the suburbs of Boston look pretty similar to the suburbs of Phoenix, and the suburbs of Miami look pretty similar to the suburbs of Portland and Chicago, and all throughout the middle part of the country. I see people are joining us here from Cincinnati and other places. So there's this vast area of relatively homogeneous land use across the country that we refer to as the American residential macro system. And in ecology and in environmental science, we've been kind of grappling with these questions of very large scale dynamics, thinking about regional to continental scale ecosystems, which necessarily involve interactions between biological and geophysical and social components. And this American residential macro system is a really good example of this new large scale thinking that we have in ecology. So the research that we're going to talk about has been funded largely by the National Science Foundation. We're very grateful for their funding. And there are two real themes that we have addressed. It's ecological homogenization and alternative futures for this American residential macro system. And we have been working in 6 cities across the United States. So we're in Boston, Baltimore, Miami, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Phoenix, and Los Angeles. And we've been at this for a long time, for more than 10 years or so. And a large number of people have been involved. A bunch of faculty members and postdoctoral researchers and graduate students and undergraduate researchers and technicians, and just a great group of people working together, coming from very different perspectives. So we have ecologists and hydrologists, wildlife biologists, and then a bunch of social scientists, geographers, cultural geographers, anthropologists, sociologists. And so it's been a nice mix of people from a wide range of academic institutions across the country. We have 3 basic questions, and we're hoping there are 3 basic questions that have been driving this research over the last 10 years or so. And the first is, why do our cities look so similar? And these are the social science drivers of why did people move from New York, where I live, to Phoenix, and plant the same vegetation that they had in New York. But the question that we're really going to talk about today is, will they always look so similar? And what are the factors driving change in this American residential macro system? And what are the factors driving stability? The group of people on this call are one of the great factors driving change in the American residential macro system. People with a genuine interest and desire and an ability to create wildlife habitat in their yards is a big factor driving change across the continent. And then what are the effects of these alternative futures on a wide variety of ecological variables? So we're going to hear about different components of biodiversity. We're going to hear a little bit about soil biogeochemistry, and we'll hear a little bit about some human factors associated with the alternative futures for the American residential macro system. So the question and the challenge that we face, or at least the experimental evidence that you're going to hear today, is we're looking at different forms of yards. And there are basically 4 different types of yards that we have been investigating in our recent research. So the first and of greatest interest here are these wildlife certified yards over here. And the real contrast that we make is between the wildlife certified yards and what we call high management yards. And these involve inputs of fertilizers, oftentimes inputs of water, occasionally inputs of pesticides. These are high input, high management lawns. They're contrasted with low management, or what we call passive lawns, which are lawns where basically people just mow. This is by far the largest group of yards across the United States are these passive yards. And so there's a real contrast between the low and the high management yards and the wildlife certified yards. We also have another factor driving change across the country is interest in water conservation, either to save water in the west with xeriscaping, or to capture water in the east with rain gardens, which are what's pictured here. In all our cities, we do comparisons between these 4 types of yards and natural areas, either natural parks representative of natural ecosystems or unmanaged parks, which contain a wider range of unmanaged vegetation. So we have a lot of response variables that you're going to hear about today. So you're going to hear about the effects of these different yard types on plants and birds and bees and soil arthropod diversity. I'm going to talk a little bit about soil stuff, and then we'll hear a little bit about governance. And again, we're doing this in all 6 cities across the country. So we've got we have replicates of these different yard types and park types in all the different cities, and we've made extensive measurements of all these response variables. And one way to look at the alternative, the alternative futures is the idea of, are we trying to bring back the heterogeneity? You know, we characterize this homogenization process across the country, and the question is, are we, with alternative futures, are we going to bring back the heterogeneity? So you look at this picture and you say, well, this is Miami and this is Phoenix, but it actually turns out they're both Phoenix. And so what we realize is that with alternative futures, we might be re-diversifying or bringing back the heterogeneity that we lost through ecological homogenization. I'm just going to say a word about soils. I'm a soil scientist, and one of our big response variables has been soil. And one of our most interesting results is that the quality of soils in yards is high. These are measurements of soil organic matter, which is a great indicator of soil quality. And you can see in the yard types, the soil organic matter levels are a little lower than they are in the natural ecosystem types, or a little higher in the wildlife certified yards than in the other types. But across the country, the soil quality is pretty high, which is good. It contributes to lots of ecosystem services that make the vegetation grow, which contributes to cooling in the summer. It creates green, which is good for aesthetics. It supports certain types of biodiversity, and there's a lot of carbon sequestration. But there are questions that this raises. And as we like to say, any good research project will raise as many questions as it answers. And one of our questions here is, does this high quality, nutrient-rich soil constrain the ability of yards to support native biodiversity? And we've become interested in this idea of a homogenization cascade, which is where if you change the soil, make it more rich, does that make it harder for certain types of native plants to establish and support wildlife communities that are associated with those native plants? And so this is a kind of an open question about, we've had some real positive results with soils, but it raises some questions about will that constrain our ability to provide native biodiversity? So that's all I had to say, and I'll pass this along. I think who do we go to next? Do we go to Sarah next? Okay, so I guess I didn't introduce myself. I'm Peter Groffman. I'm a professor at the City University of New York, and I'll pass it along to Professor Sarah Hobbie, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you, Sarah.
Thanks. Yeah, as Peter said, I'm a professor in the Ecology, Evolution and Behavior Department at the University of Minnesota. I'm really happy to be here with you today. So I'm going to focus on the plant diversity, and then I'm going to do that by way of setting up Susannah, who's going to talk more about the wildlife that potentially benefit from that plant diversity. So, and then hopefully we'll end with Kelly talking more about the social aspects. But I'll start with plants. So I'm just going to be addressing this basic question of how does plant diversity compare among these different yard management types? And again, just contrasting, I'm going to focus on the wildlife certified yards, these highly managed yards, and these low management yards. I'm not going to be talking about the yards managed for water today. So if we look just at average plant species richness in these different management types, so we're thinking here about the number of plant species per unit area. You can see that our yards generally have more species than our natural areas. And this makes sense because our yards are a mix of all of the cultivated and native species that people plant, as well as the volunteers that people didn't plant, including native species and weeds. And people are planting for a variety of reasons. They're planting, turf grass, they're planting perennials, annuals, species for food. So we have a real mix of species and as well as shrubs and trees. So we have a real mix of species in our yards, many more species than in our natural areas. But we don't see a big difference across our different yard management types. There's just a lot of variation within each management type, as you can see. And so we don't see that systematically our wildlife certified yards have markedly higher diversity per unit area. But we can also look at diversity in a different way. And that's to look at how many species we have across all of our yards and cities in these different management types. And here you can see that if we basically count the number of species in one yard and then add another yard and then add another yard, we can look at the cumulative number of species across all yards and cities. And we see that, in fact, our wildlife certified yards showed the highest number of accumulated species. Second was the low management yards, and then the high management yards among the yard types had the lowest cumulative diversity. And then all of the yards, again, were higher than the natural areas and the unmanaged parks. And we can visualize this in sort of a cartoon form. So if we contrast particularly the wildlife certified yards and the high management yards, if we looked at one yard among the wildlife certified yards, we might see 3 species, and we might see, 3 species that are different species in another wildlife certified yards. So now we have, 6 cumulative species. If we look at another yard, we might see, an additional 3 species, or I'm sorry, in the first 2, there are 5 unique species, and so on, so that we're seeing some overlap, but not a lot of overlap across yards, so that we're getting, even though we have the same, sort of number of species per yard, we're seeing an accumulation in the total number of species. If we compare that to the high management yards, we might see the same average number of species or a similar average number of species, but we're not accumulating as many species across yards. We're seeing a lot more overlap from yard to yard to yard. So higher cumulative diversity in the wildlife certified yards. So now let's talk about composition. So this is a way of assessing composition. It's called an ordination. And you can basically think about this as where these points are in space. The more distant they are from one another, that means the more distinct those communities are in terms of which species are present in the community. And so here again, we're looking at these natural areas and unmanaged parks. Those are the green areas. And then the pink and orange and purple represent the different yard management types. And you can see that we sort of have these different clusters of points, and there are a couple of take-home messages here. One is that we're not seeing, super distinctive compositions among the different yard management types, and that probably relates to, this issue that we have, that we have really different species in our yards than we do in our natural areas. And so the yards are kind of more similar to one another than the natural areas in most of our regions. And I want to kind of fill in here where some of these places are. So here I'm showing Boston, Baltimore, and Minneapolis, St. Paul. And one of the things that you'll notice about these cities is that the yards are fairly distinct from the natural areas. And this makes a lot of sense because in these areas, the natural areas tend to be forests, whereas obviously our yards are a mix of trees and herbaceous species. We see something slightly different for our warmer cities. So especially Miami actually tends to be relatively similar. The yards tend to be relatively similar in composition to the natural areas compared to some of our other cities. And the composition for LA and Phoenix is distinct for yards compared to natural areas, but a little more similar than we see for Baltimore and Boston in particular. But here I want to look at sort of a characteristic of these plants that matters for wildlife. So this is looking at heterogeneity in the mass of the seed, so the size of the seed under different management types. And so how much diversity is there in seed mass? Do we see a lot of diversity across all the species that are in a yard, or do we see low diversity? And here you can see that the wildlife certified yards actually have a greater diversity of seed mass compared to the high management or the low management yards, as well as the natural areas. So that suggests that there's a diversity of at least sizes of seed that can support wildlife. So I'm just going to stop there with a few take-home messages. So we do see higher numbers of species overall in these wildlife certified yards. In some cases, the yard types are actually more similar to one another, regardless of management, than to the natural areas and unmanaged parks in terms of the richness and composition. And this was particularly true in the sort of colder, more northern areas. And then we see a greater diversity of seed mass in these wildlife certified yards. So I'm going to pass it along to Susannah, who's going to pick that up now and talk about what's happening with wildlife.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Let's see. Nope. Okay, so as Mary mentioned when she was introducing us, this 1973 publication, and I feel really honored to be able to carry on the work of Jack Ward Thomas and Dick DeGraff. And I actually get to sit in their office where they created this publication and went on to start really trying to think about how we can manage our yards and really kind of changing the way we think about wildlife management, and to really consider yards as being very valuable to support birds and bees and other types of creatures as well. So as Peter mentioned, he set up the study of these different types of yards, these different types of parks, and the 6 different cities. And so one of the components that I was really excited about with this project is to really get a sense of how different wildlife species are responding. And so we have additional research on bees and ground arthropods. Today, I'm going to talk to you about what we found out about the birds in these different types of landscapes. And so some kind of big picture general types of results that we found when we looked at the different types of birds across these 6 cities in these different types of yards and different types of parks. We didn't see too many things that were surprising. One thing that we were able to document was that there's more species in the yards and there's more of these popular species. So in terms of species richness, so total number of different types of birds in the yards compared to parks, this wasn't surprising because these yards are going to have a mix of species of some of these native songbirds, and then also some of these more generalist species, and then also some of these more invasive types of birds. So you're going to see all different types of species, whereas in the parks, you're going to have more of these birds that have more specialized types of habitat needs. So a lot of these birds of conservation concerns, birds that are just eating insects, and a lot of these native species only, and not so much of these generalist species. In the yards, we also looked at these popularity scores, and this is a way that we were able to look at Google searches and then also eBird checklists of birders going out and documenting which birds that they were seeing in their neighborhoods. And what we found was that in our yards, they tend to be more of these, our beloved backyard birds. And so we can have a discussion about this chicken and the egg in terms of, are these our beloved birds because they're in our yards, or do our yards support these birds? But anyways, it's really demonstrating that we have these opportunities to just look out our window and spend time in our yards, regardless of how they're landscaped, and enjoy birds that bring us some happiness. But the part that was really exciting was looking at turnover. And so this is a similar way of looking at the bird community, as Sarah discussed, in terms of looking at these species accumulation curves. So it's kind of a similar type of analysis, but again, gets at a similar type of response rate. And so again, looking at the specific types of plants and comparing the wildlife certified yards with the parks area, what we're seeing here in this figure is that the wildlife certified yards, in terms of the bird communities, are more similar in terms of the types of birds that they have as the parks that we have. And so that they're behaving more like these parks rather than these other types of yard management. So the way this plays out, again, similar to how Sarah explained it, is that we start off with our wildlife certified yard and we go to our first yard and we see a cardinal, an American robin, and a pileated woodpecker. So this is very northeastern focused. That's where I'm at in Western Massachusetts. We go to another yard and we pick up a wood thrush, so new species. Oh, and look, there's a black-capped chickadee. And we go to our third yard and we see a black-capped chickadee, there's a wood thrush. Oh, and another new species, there's a gray catbird. We go to the fourth yard and there's yet another new species that we observe. So there's a yellow warbler. And so what this is implying is that if we continue to increase the number of yards that are certified as wildlife habitat, because they're so different from each other, we have this great opportunity of providing additional habitat for additional species. Whereas when we go to these yards that are managed primarily for lawns, especially these high management yards that have high levels of fertilizer and irrigation and other types of inputs, basically we're going to see the same species when we go from yard to yard to yard. We're going to get our grackles, our pigeons, and our house sparrows, with some variation as well. But again, so what this is demonstrating is that these yards, when they're managed for wildlife, really can try to counteract this homogenization that Peter discussed at the beginning of our presentation. And so another way to look at this when we want to think about our parks and yards is that our certified wildlife habitat yards, they're really can be clustered closer to these parks in terms of their ability and their capacity to really try to improve and increase biodiversity and provide habitat. And then kind of going back to what Mary was talking about in terms of trying to reverse some of these declines, at least for birds in these habitat types. And so I want to end up by talking about this conservation strategy of land sharing versus land sparing. And this is something that a lot of wildlife biologists talk about in terms of how do we protect land. And so this idea of land sharing is really kind of when we think about yards, especially with these certified habitat yards, this idea that you have these bits of pockets of habitat scattered throughout an area. Whereas this idea of land sparing really implies of setting aside large tracts of land and then developing elsewhere. And so what our research has demonstrated is that with these two different approaches, you really have an opportunity for land sharing to be able to have opportunities for us to interact with some of these, our beloved bird species, whereas land sparing really can get at protecting these birds of conservation concern. And so it's really been set up as this either or component, but I think what our research is showing is that it's not an either or, but rather an and that both of these approaches to conservation and providing habitat really have a lot of value, especially when we're talking about getting people excited about wildlife and getting them to support different types of programs like certifying their yards for wildlife habitat. And so with this, again, really kind of demonstrating that these wildlife certified habitats are really making a contribution to supporting some species. And if we continue to increase that number, so it's up to 275,000 right now, if we continue that number into the future across these different landscapes, really have an opportunity to continue to start getting at some of these losses of biodiversity. And so with that, I will stop sharing.
Yeah.
And then we have I don't know, Mary, if you want to just say.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just really wanted to thank Sarah and Susannah and Peter. At this point, we're supposed to have Kelly Larson, Professor Kelly Larson from Arizona State University. She's with the School of Sustainability and the School of Geographical and Urban Planning. Unfortunately, she was having technical difficulty and could not connect to this webinar. So Susannah is going to present her portion. And one of the things I wanted to mention about this is really an important, all of it's been important, but this part for all of you watching, it gives you really good information about how you can play a role in increasing awareness. And it's really the social science, some of the social science around people's behaviors with these yards. So just to set that up, and thank you, Susannah, for taking over those slides.
Yeah. And I know Kelly's out there, so
Yes.
I hope I
Shout
did her
out to
proud.
Kelly. She's called in somewhere, is listening. Thank you so much, Kelly. And we're really sorry you're not on.
All right. So, and thankfully Kelly put notes in her slides too.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so yeah, so I think for me, and I think for a lot of us on this team, a really exciting component of the research is being able to integrate with social scientists, because I think, you know, even though the soils are really important, and then in terms of the plants and what they're supporting and how the birds are responding, but at the end of the day, we really need to know how people are interacting with these different types of yards and what do they think. And so again, to put this into perspective, a lot of the research that Kelly and other people on our team have been doing is getting at some of these different types of attitudes and behaviors of the wildlife, or not just the wildlife gardeners, but gardeners across the United States within these 6 cities. And really getting at different types of questions about their motivations for different types of landscapes. And so some general results, or so what people are really kind of getting at is really trying to understand what could be some of these barriers to having wildlife yards. And so for everybody on this call, it seems like you've been able to navigate some of these barriers, but what we're finding from some of the research that's been led by Kelly for over the last 10 years is that this perception of messiness is that we're so used to having these neat and tidy yards, and that when you start veering from this norm, it becomes unacceptable. And so having something that looks a little bit wild, out of control, might be a huge barrier for trying to expand that number, to double it from 275,000 to triple it, or to, you know, to make it so it has a really significant impact across the landscape. And so from Kelly's research and some previous without the team, and then also throughout the whole 6 cities, the 2 main components that people are really, why they're managing their yards, is primarily for the appearance, and they want it to be easy to maintain. So that's really what's driving some of people's decisions. And in a study of looking at this question, only 1% mentioned wildlife. And so again, everybody on this call is pretty unique in that perspective. But again, really making sure that when we continue to increase the number of wildlife habitat gardens, and I'm sure many people on this call could probably talk about this, the importance of appeasing our neighbors and making sure that it looks nice. And then also for some people that just want it to be easy to maintain. And in addition, so some of the other research from the Macro Systems Project is also looking at the importance. And so when asked with this question of different types of priorities, so only 1% say that wildlife is important, yet when we asked people within these 6 different cities across the United States, people had mentioned that managing for wildlife was moderately or very important to people that were surveyed. So there seems to be some way for us to get in there. But again, this idea that it's important, but making sure that when we try to continue to promote this, that we're really talking about the aesthetics and the ease of maintenance components. One of the really cool ways to get about this is this idea of these cues to care. And this is a term that was coined by Dr. Joan Nassauer. She's a landscape architect. She's at the University of Michigan, coined this term back in, I think, 1995. And it's really a way of trying to reconcile this messiness, this perceived messiness of these wildlife gardens with this aesthetic. And so really trying to get at that, that it's not necessarily neglect, but it's intentional. And so there's some tips here that I'm sure many of you are using as well, in terms of mowing or maintaining some of these edges, making sure that the plants get spaced a little bit more deliberately, increasing the number of flowers so that it has that aesthetic appeal. And then also other types of features like having bird feeders and bird boxes, nest boxes. Again, it's going to have these cues to care that there's a human hand that's part of the development and the design of these landscapes. And so a recent paper that came out a couple of months ago has really demonstrated what is the potential for future people to adopt these wildlife supporting yard features. And so what we're finding is that the vast majority are saying that they will maintain, or they're likely to add a wildlife supporting yard in the future. And so I think this really demonstrates there's a lot of hope and a lot of potential for going out and talking with your neighbors and letting them know that there are ways that they can continue to manage for wildlife, and they can do it in a way that looks nice. And so again, I think this is really providing some opportunities for us to continue figuring out what works well of truly trying to get additional people on board. Because we also find out that people who have garden as a hobby, those are the ones who are really the ones who are likely to be managing for wildlife. And so perhaps master gardeners who might not be focusing on wildlife, this could be an in for them to try to get them to change some of their behaviors so that it's a little bit more wildlife friendly. And so again, this, so there's the gardener's component, and so that could get at the aesthetics, but this low maintenance priorities component is also really important. So I think for many of us, really trying to find ways that it's minimal effort to still be able to have it look nice and to provide wildlife habitat. And so some tips that we have here on the left in terms of using native plants or locally adapted plants is going to be easier. These are going to be plants that are going to be easier to maintain, slow growing plants, and also to minimize the watering and pruning. And so there's times in the year when plants just don't need to be watered. And this is especially the case in arid cities, especially out west. And so final some recommendations. These are 3 tips to leave you. And here we have Joe Nassauer on the bottom right here. These cues to care can really increase this aesthetic appreciation, really make sure to promote vegetation and other features that are low maintenance, and how we can communicate with others to establish these norms and recruit others to get on board and join these wildlife habitat certification programs. So with that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Susannah. I'm going to share a couple resources. We're getting a lot of questions about other resources that we can share, and I'll share some of those as well. And I'm not sure why this isn't switching over. I'm not sure what people can see right now, but I know a couple people were saying, please put full screen, and we've got full screen, but I'm not sure why it's not switching speakers. Anyways, wanted to answer some of the questions that were in the chat. I put a number of links in the chat. One of the questions is, how will we get all these links? We will send an email to the participants with those who registered and are online with the links that we shared in the chat. We also are recording this. One of the questions, and any of our panelists can jump in and answer this. And one of the key one is in the, I'm not sure, let's see here. We've got a couple I'm pulling up here. So there was a question about natives versus non-natives. Why does it have to be one way or the other? Some native gardens do look messy. I have a hybrid garden that gets loads of pollinators. Oh, I see. Okay. So that's a really good question. I put one of the tip sheets in the chat that shows you kind of how to structure a garden. One of the reasons we're really advocating natives is that the natives have co-evolved with certain wildlife species for millennia, in many cases, where they actually provide specific functions. And I guess a real simple one that most people are familiar with is milkweed. Monarch caterpillars cannot survive without the milkweed. These two species have co-evolved together. And there's many, many others. And someone in the chat mentioned Dr. Doug Tallamy. We work closely with Dr. Tallamy. In fact, he has created and his team, Kimberly Shropshire and others, on his team at the University of Delaware provided all the data that's in our native plant finder. And you can put your zip code in and it will give you a list of native plants that support the highest numbers of Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths where you live. We are also have keystone plant lists that show the specific types of plants that also support pollen specialist bees. So when people say, why is there this push for the natives? It's because the natives have essential ecological functions that are critical to protecting and helping these species thrive. But a good rule of thumb, because again, a lot of people, even my own yard, I have this huge heritage rose in my yard and it's an old property. It's been there for 40 years. Obviously not every single one of my plants are native, but I'm really striving for 80% native and 20% other types of non-invasive plants. So that's one question. And then more people wanted to know how to certify, and that's nwf.org/certify. Actually, nwf.org/garden has many resources. It actually goes in depth on each of the elements of habitat, food, water, cover, and places to raise young. So there's a variety of things there that we can help. And thank you, David. Mizajewski is on line with us, our naturalist, and he is putting also some tips into the chat. Does anyone have some specific questions for any of our panelists? A lot of these are about resources, but anything about any of the research that was shared, anything you wanted to clarify, anything else like that? So those are some of the things I'm looking here through the chat to see if I missed anything. Yes, lists of native plants. A lot of what we're putting in the chat right now will lead you to various lists of native plants for your yard. And we also have gardenforwildlife.com that actually has native plant kits, basically native plant gardens for 36 states right now. We don't have as many, we don't have the whole country yet. Let's see. Well, this is a good question about fertilizer. I mean, actually native plants and milkweed do not need fertilizer. You really just, that's the point of these plants, is that they're very adaptable to your local area. And I think one of the things that you can do is you can use natural compost. That's a good way to put nutrients into your soil if needed, depending on your soil. So it's interesting. Someone just asked about asters and goldenrod. Asters and goldenrod are two genus that are actually keystone plants. And the question is, there are different goldenrods. Goldenrods usually are native, so I'm not sure about the question if there's similar ones to native. There are the asters that you see kind of seasonally in the fall in some parts of the country. Those usually are hybrids or cultivars. They may or may not have all the wildlife benefits bred out of them. So it is better to plant the natural native aster that has co-evolved with these different species over time. Lots of really good questions in here. Oh, yes, we'd like to hear a little bit more about the social science. And I think this is a great question, Kathy Daniel. I get pushback about all of my native plant and nature postings, and I'm afraid I'm making neighbors feel guilty rather than inspiring them. Any tips? Susannah, do you want to take that one?
I think, yeah, so I liked how somebody had written before, like, why is it, either or? So I think having some, and so I think it's really trying to meet people where they're at. So native plants are wonderful, and then some non-native plants are okay. And so really trying to figure out, other opportunities, get people sort of on board, and then start getting a little bit more enthusiastic about the importance of native plants. But I think, again, I really like this idea of having 70% native plants in terms of these trophic dynamics, in terms of supporting birds. But it's a little overwhelming if you're starting with 0. And so to get all the way to 70, sometimes, I don't know, to me, I know I would just be like, forget it. I can't deal with that. I'm just going to stick with my lawn. And so I think, trying to find all of these different opportunities. And I think what our research is showing is that, these yards, they all have some value. So again, it depends on what people want. So even the yards that are not the yards that are, I think it was the low management lawns. So as Sarah showed, they still have a lot of high plant diversity as well. And so again, it's like, I think in terms of that sustainability component, and so kind of laying off a little bit on some of the chemicals that we're putting into these yards. I think that like maybe to start with that in terms of some of these behaviors rather than going straight into what you should do. So maybe to focus on what we shouldn't be doing to try to create more habitat.
Great, thank you.
I would add to that, the social science piece has been super interesting to us as ecologists. And the thing we realize is people's yards are important to them, but for very different reasons. And so many people are, people on this call are really excited about increasing biodiversity, and they're prepared to do a lot of work to do that. Other people are much less interested in that. They want to sit in the yard and talk with their neighbors or throw a ball with their kids, and they're not all that interested in native plants. And I do think, as Susannah says, we need to meet people where they are. The other thing is and I personally relate to this very strongly, is people are lazy, or maybe they're not lazy, maybe they're busy, maybe they don't have a lot of time to spend buying, planting, weeding, managing complex wildlife gardens, and that's also fine. And so I think it is important. One of the biggest social functions of our yards is to build cohesion, social cohesion in our neighborhoods. I'd like to think in my neighborhood, I really like my neighbors. I know that if my property looks really messy, they're going to be unhappy with me. I don't want my neighbors to be unhappy. Being inherently lazy, I do the minimum amount I need to do to keep my neighbors happy. And I think that makes me, it's good for me, it's good for my neighbors. And so I think this idea of it's good that the person who wrote this question is worried about, am I bothering my neighbors? No. By being enthusiastic about your plants, no, you're not. But as long as you're prepared to respect their choices, I think we'll all be happier.
Thank you, Peter. And
actually, Mary, I got a text from Kelly. So Kelly's
oh, good. Kelly has an answer.
Something to say too.
You.
Yeah, and I think exactly what to kind of build on what Peter was saying is like this whole idea of positive messaging. So again, I think people don't want to be told that they're doing something wrong and they're bad. So really trying to figure out how you can do that. And again, what is easy? So Peter talked about this idea of being lazy, and so it's again like things that they don't have to do. So like don't mow your lawn every week. Don't mow your lawn for the whole month of May. There's these ways that you can try to get people to do stuff. And then, also thinking about these cues to care. So having these signs in there to let the neighbors know so that you're not upsetting your neighbors as well.
That is an excellent point. And we are getting some amazing questions in here. Really, really in-depth, wonderful questions. And actually, Aaron, who's helping facilitate this, Aaron, can you make sure that we capture the full chat? Because I would like to capture these and get back to get some answers out to folks, maybe via email, because there's just such a richness in what's showing up here. And I did have some specific questions so there's questions going on in the chat and there's questions going on in the Q&A. So let me look at the Q&A for a second, because I haven't had a chance to look at that. And this is a good question we get all the time, is that our native plants or some native plants are toxic to children and pets. I mean, to be perfectly honest, many plants are toxic to children and pets. It's not just native plants. So I think you have to use the same principles you would use for any kind of plants that you're putting in your yard, and teach both the children and pets to stay away from them. I will say one thing, and actually Doug Tellamy says this a lot too. The toxicity, for example, in milkweed, which is actually in the plant, it's evolved in the plant. It's part of what the caterpillar absorbs that makes it nasty tasting to its predators. That was all part of the design of the evolution and science. A lot of it's not something that if someone took a nibble, I mean, not someone, a pet took a nibble of, was going to have super drastic effects. But most animals also are deterred from actually eating these plants that have toxicity. It's just part of the science and the way it is. So I would just, if you have a real concern, is really, creating a space and making sure that you don't have your kids and pets around really a variety of plants, not just the native plants. So that would be one thing. And then a lot of people, just because it's coming up so often in here, have said, is there a connection between Dr. Tallamy's Homegrown National Park and National Wildlife Certified Wildlife Habitat? Well, his Homegrown National Park is to get basically, you know, the same message we've been doing on Certified Wildlife Habitats and Garden for Wildlife for many years. He's just got a different website with all of his resources. We are hoping to get more of our Certified Wildlife Habitats onto his map. So we are collaborating with him closely on that. Another question I have here is, let's see. Do we have any programs? Gosh, there's just so many here. Programs we can give to you. Any other specific questions for our panelists before I move into the ones that are more National Wildlife Federation focused? Before we kind of close up here, because there's so many here. People are sharing landscaper resources. This is awesome. Someone mentioned HOAs. HOAs are absolutely key. And our community wildlife habitats program, we have so many volunteers working in those programs nationwide. They work closely with HOAs, and our community wildlife habitat staff actually developed a resource for HOAs to look at ordinances that are more friendly to more wildlife and native plant friendly. So there's a bunch of tips, and we'll put that resource in the links as well that we send out. Just trying to see what else we have here. Again, any more specific questions? I love all the questions, but I just want to make sure we take advantage of the amazing expertise of our researchers. Anything else about their study that people had a question on? Oh, good question. What is your next project, Peter and team? And also another question that I did see is, when is the bee and arthropod research going to be available?
So I kind of hinted at the next project a little bit in my last slide. We're very interested in this idea of a homogenization cascade, and does the alteration of soils, which is very common in our yards, does that help us achieve certain ecosystem services, or does it constrain? In particular, we're concerned about constraints of ecosystem services related to native biodiversity. A lot of native plants as people pointed out in the chat, they don't need fertilizer. They oftentimes do very well under low nutrient conditions with very specific collections of soil fungi and bacteria in the soil. And sometimes those are hard to establish in soils. And so we're really interested in this soil component. And we're also very much interested in exploring some of the equity issues associated with yard landscaping. So we work in these large metropolitan areas, and the distribution of ecological amenities and disamenities is very unequal within the cities and also in the rural areas. And so we were very interested in understanding how that varies and what perhaps can be done to address some of those inequities in the work. It's also, I guess, this question about the bugs. So I know that the soil arthropod paper was an excellent paper, was just submitted. The reviewers didn't perhaps agree with my assessment, and so there's which is the scientific process always. In order for us to produce results, it goes through a very rigorous peer review process, and so sometimes it takes a while to get these out. But the data look fascinating. And again, it's not who were the laboratory technicians when they got the samples from the wildlife yards? They were like, how am I going to count all these bugs? And I said, well, it's good that there's a lot of bugs in there, and so I think those results are coming, and they're going to be really good. We are hoping to keep this research going just because we're very excited about the topic. We're excited about the ability to engage with people like this groups, and we're excited about the ability to work across disciplines, which is not so easy. You know, I don't have that many projects with social scientists like Kelly at the same time that I have biodiversity people and hydrologists, and so it's a unique project, and we hope to keep it going.
Thank you, Peter. That is one of the things that well, many things is so phenomenal. But again, the cross disciplines and all the universities that you showed on your original slides when you kicked this off was just so impressive and so rich. And the learnings between all these institutions has just been really phenomenal.
And I guess the other thing that we're trying to push, and this has become very common in science in general and environmental science in particular, is engaging with stakeholders in what we call participatory action research. So I have a whole bunch of questions for the people on this call about what they're seeing in their yards and in their neighbors. In particular, how many wildlife certified yards do I need to bring back the community of prairie birds, in the Twin Cities? There's a bunch of scale dynamics that we're interested in, and I suspect that the people on this call have a lot of insights. And so that's another frontier for us, is this participatory action research.
Yes, and we definitely want to explore and help coordinate that. So exciting, really interested also in the equity issues. National Wildlife Federation has a strong commitment to environmental justice, and exploring that in the garden space is something that we're very committed to, but it's an area that definitely needs more research, more input, and more data, and more engagement of BIPOC participants and partners in that space. And so that's something we'd love to talk with you more about as well. So very, very excited. We are going to try to capture everything that's in this chat. There's just so many amazing questions, and to Peter's point, you can see through the dialogue a very engaged group that we have on here today. So I cannot thank you all enough for attending today, for everything you're doing for wildlife, and we will definitely try to get the answers to many of the questions here sent out via email. So we had a question: is there going to be any studies done in the Pacific Northwest? There was a little question. That's one of my last questions, I guess, I have related to the research. I don't know. I guess in future studies, are you branching out into other geographic areas, Peter and team?
Well, so we have one of the collaborators on the current project is at Portland State University doing some of the soils work, but the sampling is really intensive. And so we've been very shy about adding other cities, but certainly the Pacific Northwest is kind of a big gaping hole. You look at that map. And so yeah, we would like to. We also want to go to other countries, and see do the dynamics change. There's a lot of other cities we'd like to go to. So
that is great.
But the Pacific Northwest, and people have beautiful yards.
They
Pacific Northwest
do.
too.
And we have some great wildlife gardeners, very engaged in that area as well as others. Sarah, I think you might have some closing comments. Do you have anything you want to share?
I was just gonna, I don't know if we have time, because I was gonna talk about one more study that Susannah and I are involved with, just in the city, in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis-St. Paul Metro, which is getting kind of to this issue of how do you get people to do this. And so the state of Minnesota has a program whereby you can apply for a grant to put in a bee-friendly lawn.
Yeah.
And so talking about like scaling issues. So Susannah is part of a team that is actually trying to go in and say, okay, so people have planted these bee-friendly lawns, like, is it working? Do we see that that it's promoting, larger populations of pollinators? And does it make a difference? So that's an example. It's not an ordinance, it's actually a grant incentive, but that's some research that's just getting going just in the Twin Cities, FYI.
Thank you so much. Well, the one last question here, since it dovetails on what Sarah just said, is how do you find resources for some of these bee-friendly lawns? I know where I live, there's Rainscape in Montgomery County. So to look at your county, state, and municipal resources, sometimes they have incentive programs like the one in Minnesota or others. So that's a first place to go for those. They sometimes have an Office of Sustainability or green building or something like that. And that's often where these kinds of incentive programs are housed. I just want to honor everyone's time, and thanks again to this amazing panel. We miss you, Kelly. We are sorry we could not see you today, but we are going to come back, because I hope that there's just so much here and so much more on these other studies that I would love to have some follow-up webinars and engagement about. And maybe someday we can do this in person. That would be awesome too. So anyway, so good to see you all. Thank you. And thank you to everyone online participating today. Have a wonderful holiday weekend. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.